On today's video, we're going to go over some of the dimensions and some of the materials I used to build this deer blind last fall. And, you know, as long as we're at it, we might as well plow a little snow. Hey there, outdoor YouTubers. Well, like I said earlier, today I'm going to go over some of the dimensions and some of the materials that I used when I built this deer blind last fall. Now, I did do a video about me and my son getting that deer blind out into the woods. We built it in sections. I did do some videos on us carrying out there and putting it together. But since then, I have gotten a lot of questions about, okay, you know, what materials did you use? Did you use 2x3s, 2x2s? You know, what did you use for this? What did you use for that? What are the dimensions? Stuff like that. So, as long as I'm out doing a little snow plowing today, I thought maybe we could talk about that. One thing about this particular deer blind is that the spot that we put it in was not very easy to get to. All right, so we built this blind in sections. There really was no access to this blind like with a pickup truck or a side-by-side or a four-wheeler, nothing like that. We had to carry this by hand out to this spot. So we even took it one step further, you know, like each wall wasn't even just one piece. Each wall was actually two pieces, all right? And the overall footprint of the blind was 6x6, and the back end of the blind was 7 feet high, and the front end was 6 feet high. We had a flat roof to it, and then that difference from front to back is what gave us a little bit of an angle to that flat roof. If the footprint of this blind is 6x6, we of course need to make a 6x6 floor. The floor joists, at least the perimeter ones, we used treated 2x8 to make them up. So we made a 6x6 square with those, and then the interior floor joists, we just used treated 2x6, and we used joist hangers to connect those. Those interior floor joists were mounted at 24-inch centers. And then for the flooring itself, we used 3/4-inch plywood. Then we put the whole floor on top of these treated lumber blocks. And I made those blocks out of like two pieces of treated 4x4, and they were sandwiched between two pieces of treated 2x8. And that made us up a real nice block to mount the entire floor on. And of course, we had to dig a little bit here and there to get the floor level. And then as I was building the walls of this deer blind, I had kind of a shed with a plywood floor in it, and I snapped a 6-foot by 6-foot chalk line on the inside floor of that shed, and then I built those walls and kind of put them into place just to kind of make sure everything would come together right. And again, each wall is two separate sections, and I used 2x4s for the studs of the walls, and I used 3/8 inch plywood for the sheathing on the outside of the walls. Now, you could have went a lot smaller and a lot lighter. Could have went with 2x3s, you could have went with 2x2s, could have went with 1/4-inch plywood. But just the fact that each wall was going to be in two sections, carrying it out by hand, So those half sections, you know, of each wall were pretty manageable to carry out. Now, don't get me wrong, it took us several trips, but that little extra weight really didn't bother us with just those, you know, half wall sections. The back side of the blind, where we would be entering into it, was 7 feet high. And the front part of the blind, where I'm kind of expecting to be facing most of the time, looking out windows, hopefully seeing deer from that direction, was 6 feet high. Okay, so the roof slanted downward to the front. Now, I did get some questions from a few viewers on that other video, you know, thinking it was a real bad idea to do it that way, because like rain would come dripping down, and it would be dripping down in front of where you're viewing and looking for deer. Okay, and that is a very true thing, and that is something I did consider. I've built this style of deer blind several different ways. I've built it with the roof slanting back, so everything rushes out the back, you know, as far as raindrops or rain running off. I've also built one where it angled to the side. So I have kind of thought about those things, and I decided to do it that way on this blind for a couple reasons. All right, one reason is when you're building a deer blind, it's, you know, 6 by 6 and at least 6 feet high. That's a pretty big flat surface. You know, kind of sticks out a little bit in the woods. So I liked the idea of having that slanted roof facing the direction that I'm hoping to see the deer come from. It kind of gave the blind like multiple dimensions instead of one just big flat surface. And then another reason that I wanted to do that is when you have plexiglass windows on a deer blind, those do shine off a lot of glare, all right? And especially like, say there's a deer out there that you'd like to shoot and you're opening a plexiglass window, there's a lot of movement, a lot of glare, a lot of flicker that comes from that sort of thing. So I liked the idea of having the roof slant forward and maybe cast a little bit more shade on the plexiglass windows that I'm going to be looking through. And really, if it gets to be a problem, like say rain coming off the front edge of the blind in the direction that you're looking, if that gets to be a problem, it really wouldn't be that difficult to get some kind of rain diverter, a rain gutter, you know, just about anything on that front edge of the blind and kind of divert that rain off to the side so it's not dripping right in front of where you're looking. I don't think it's too big a deal. And you know, there might be some days a little bit of rain dripping down in between you and the deer maybe adds a little bit of camouflage for you, especially like I say, when you're opening up this plexiglass window, you know, sticking the barrel of a gun out this window, you know, might add a little bit of camouflage anyways. And I'll leave a link to that video down in the description of this one if you want to check it out. And I'll tell you guys, if you're gonna go to all the trouble to build yourself a nice deer blind, I really do like having it, you know, at least 6 feet high. I really like the ability to stand up in the blind while you're hunting. Stand up, stretch. It's just so much easier to get in and out of. And that also brings me to the door. You know, again, if you're gonna go to all that trouble and you're gonna build yourself, you know, this really cool, nice deer blind, you're gonna put the effort and the money into it, give yourself a nice high door that's easy to get in and out of. Don't skimp and build yourself like a little hobbit-sized door, and you'll just regret it. You know, every time you head out hunting, I know sometimes it's tempting to say, oh, I'll just build this small little door. It'll be so much easier. No big deal, I can just crouch down when I'm getting in and out. But you know, you're going in and out with a backpack, a gun, you know, and whatever else you might be bringing. Yeah, don't skimp on the door, guys. Give yourself a nice, tall, you know, appropriately wide door, and you'll be happy that you did. And I'll tell you another thing when it comes to the door is, you know, don't just take like a piece of plywood and screw some hinges to it and call that your door. You know, make sure that you give this door a nice frame and then it's going to be kind of rigid. Okay, I've seen guys, you know, build nice deer blinds and then they try to cut a little corner on the door. Just use a piece of plywood, screw a hinge on it, and call that your door. And you know, after one season, that piece of plywood is just going to warp. That door's not going to close right. So you know, make sure and give your door a good frame, some good structure to it, so it holds its true shape. And you know, guys, if you're interested in this sort of content, be sure to check out our Patreon page. I'll leave a link below in the description of this video that'll bring you right to it. So that brings us up to the roof, and my roof trusses were built with 2x4s on edge, and the roof sheathing itself were rough cut 1x lumber. And a couple of reasons that I really like using that rough cut 1x lumber. Okay, and when I say rough cut, that means it's a true 1-inch board, 1-inch thick board. And a couple things that are nice about that. One is you certainly have the strength of a good 1-inch board, which is ideal for a roof. And the other thing is, I like to be able to nail, in my case it was roofing nails, but it could be a different type of fastener, into the side edge of this rough cut 1x stuff. Okay, and we'll get into that a little bit more after I talk about the roofing itself. All right, so I had this 1x lumber cut, 1-inch thick. It was kind of slightly random widths, but I used 8-foot lengths. So, you know, if you do the math, right, I got a 6-foot deer blind, you know, 6 foot by 6 foot footprint. And then I take these 8-foot long boards for the roof. That gives me a 1-foot overhang on each side, which is kind of nice, right? Keep some of the weather off the blind. Now the roofing itself, you know, after I put that 1x rough cut stuff down, I laid down a layer of tar paper across the whole thing. And then I put down a layer of snow and ice guard. Okay, the granulated snow and ice guard, the kind that's sticky on one side, granulated, you know, gritty on the other. And that's my actual exposed roof. And now we're kind of getting back to, you know, being able to nail into the sides of that 1x lumber. So I left quite a bit of overhang with that snow and ice guard, and then none of the fasteners went on top. All the roofing nails that I used went along the side edge of the blind roof, and then that excess that was hanging over becomes my drip edge. I did get some comments from the other video saying, well, that edge where you bend that snow and ice guard, that snow and ice guard is going to crack. And I'll tell you, I would have kind of thought that myself, but I did the same thing with a deer blind, like I think at least 10 years ago. And each year I go back to it and I'm like, oh, I wonder if this is that year where that snow and ice guard is going to kind of crack on that edge. Probably have to redo the roof. And so far, like I said, I think it's been like 10 years and it's doing just fine. Okay, so at least for a while, that's really going to work for you. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, a more permanent solution might be a metal roof or a shingled roof with true like aluminum drip edge all around. You know, I totally agree that that's a more permanent solution. But, you know, when you're carrying all this stuff into the woods, it's not an easy place to get to. If you can just take a few armloads of that snow and ice guard under your arm, and of course that tar paper is super light, and get a good roof that really will last you for many, many years, that's not a bad way to go. It's a lot easier than carrying bundles of shingles out in the woods. We already had our hands full carrying all that stuff out there, so we can put off dealing with bundles of shingles for 10 or 15 years. We'll take it. So now we'll talk about the interior of the blind a little bit. We put down a chunk of carpeting on the floor. That adds for insulation, and it also kind of keeps the noise down, you know, when you're shuffling around in the blind. We did insulate the walls. We used foil-faced sheets of insulation. I had some stuff left over. I think we used kind of a combination of 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch. You just kind of cut that foil-faced insulation to size and stick the different sections into the cavities of the deer blind. And then the one thing we did with this deer blind is we just screwed some screws in kind of at an angle, and then they held the foil face in place. You could glue it, okay, but by the time we got around to doing this, it was kind of late in the fall, so I wasn't really too keen on how well glue might work. And then another way that I've done it in the past is come from the outside of the deer blind, run 1 or 2 screws into each piece of foil face, but then have a little block of wood on the other side, so that screw screws into that block of wood, that little block of wood, and it just sucks that foil face tight against the wall. And then any of the small gaps between like the 2x4 studs and the foil face, we just you know, put some spray foam in there, and you know, that really helps to keep that foil face in place too. It helps to keep bugs from getting in and behind the foil face, in between the wall and the foil face. You don't want bugs taking up residency. This is another thing that I really do like to do to deer blinds, is add a vent. And it actually serves 2 purposes. I usually will get kind of a screened vent, and I will place it where I can look out of the vent when I'm standing up in the deer blind, like out in the direction that I expect to have the deer coming from, or expect to see deer. So what that does is, say I'm standing up, I want to stretch my legs, I've been sitting out in the blind for a long time, want to stand up. Well, I can look out through this screened vent, and you know, I can see if there's any deer moving around out there. Whereas if you don't really have that, and you stand up, you got to constantly keep bending over. Oh, is there some deer out there? And I got to bend over and look out the window. So that's one reason I like to have this screen vent, just kind of a small viewing window for when I'm standing up. The other reason is, when you start building these a little bit nicer deer blinds and you get them sealed up really good, okay, you can imagine this, you get this blind all sealed up, trying to keep mice out of it, and it's you know, you want it to be weatherproof, okay? Well, you're always going to drag some moisture in there, right? Deer season, your boots are going to be wet, you know, there's no getting around it. You are going to bring moisture into that blind. Now, you close this thing up, and if it's sealed up really good and you got moisture in it, during the off season, you're going to get mold and mildew in there, because that moisture has nowhere to go. So that's the other reason that it's pretty handy to have a little vent. All right, now I do like to keep the heat in, so a lot of times I'll just take like a small piece of rubber, and I'll use that as kind of a flapper, almost like a curtain that I can flap down and kind of cover up that vent. Now this particular deer blind, I didn't really seal up around the door really good and permanent. Sometimes you can take that sealant, those strips of insulation, and kind of line all around the door and keep it, keep little drafts from coming through the door. Well, I didn't do that with this deer blind. So I do feel comfortable that there is enough airflow in and around the door on this one. So I'll be okay this off season without having that vent. But probably next, like I say, next fall, next summer, I'll get back out there. I'm gonna add a vent, and I'll probably seal up around the door even better. Up here in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, we do get some pretty cold deer seasons. I'm kind of a wimpy hunter these days, or at least at this stage in my life. I like to have a heater in the blind with me. So we're gonna seal it up all nice. We are gonna have that vent so we don't get mold and mildew in the off season. But that seems to work pretty good. And that vent can also act as a little bit of a thermostat. If it's getting too hot in the blind, you can open up that flap, even if you're not looking through it, and get a little ventilation, get a little bit of that heat to escape and cool things down a little bit. Another thing that people asked about as far as that deer blind is, why don't you have any windows on the side? Well, that's always an exercise in compromise when it comes to more or less windows on a deer blind. Okay, more windows, obviously you can see more areas. Maybe you'll see some deer that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. But more windows also means more light getting inside of the blind, okay? You got to watch your movement a little bit more. I really do like having it somewhat dark in the blind, and that's another thing that I do inside most blinds, is I will paint kind of a black background, so those deer can't really silhouette your movement nearly as easy. You got that black background. I don't have a lot of windows in it, so it's a little bit dark in the blind. You can get away with a lot of movement. And here's a couple tips when you're dealing with plexiglass. Plexiglass can be somewhat brittle, especially the thinner stuff. So whenever I'm cutting plexiglass to size, I'll actually use an angle grinder with a cutting wheel. Sometimes if you use just a regular jigsaw or a circular saw, it'll actually crack the plexiglass as you're cutting it. And it's kind of the same thing when you're drilling holes in plexiglass. Just a regular drill with a drill bit oftentimes will crack the plexiglass. So what I like to do is to actually melt the holes in the plexiglass, and that seems to work pretty good. The particular spot that this deer blind is at, generally speaking, it does seem like the deer are pretty much more in front of you. And the deer that have kind of come from the sides, I'm just kind of judging off the game camera photos, they do wind up passing in front of you. I'm kind of on the edge of a clear cut. Those deer travel kind of on that edge. I'm tucked back into the woods just a little bit, okay? The deer do travel the edge of that clear cut. So you just kind of got to make your own judgment when it comes to that sort of thing. Eat shark. Very good. So guys, if you're interested in more videos about getting out and enjoying the great outdoors of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, be sure to check out the entire channel. And if you enjoy what you see, please consider liking and subscribing. And for bonus content, be sure to check out our Patreon page. A link to this page can be found in the description of this video. And also guys, remember to hunt, fish, laugh, repeat. Thanks for watching, and God bless.